Hello again, Steve Smith here. Thank you for tuning in to presentation number 12 in the series, and if by any chance you've been doing these in order, I admire your indefatigability. That was quite hard to say. But I hope you're finding these things interesting and getting a mix of theory and practice. There's a reminder of my blog and informedlanguageteacher.com for more readings and videos and so on about research and language teaching. So this one is more focused on the theory, and then in presentation 13 I'm going to give you some more practical tips about how you can use reading texts. So today then the subject is reading. Now to start with, can you just read that text in front of you? And my question is, how do we actually understand a text like that? Well, to start with, you certainly need to be able to recognize words and chunks, content words and chunks. Here's the thing, the idea of arriving, hotel, realize, booked, and so on. So all those words are, if you like, content words, which provide an awful lot of the meaning. So recognizing words and chunks is clearly crucial, and we've said the same before for listening. But we also need to be able to parse the sentences grammatically to make sense. So, for example, we need to pick out clues to the grammar. When I arrived, the idea that we've got past tense there, the negative didn't. Had been booked, the idea that it's a passive there, not an active, the negative here, sorted, and so on. So we need both information about lexis and we need information about grammar. We also need top-down knowledge, not just the decoding knowledge, the bottom-up skills, but the top-down knowledge. So we need to know, the sort of thing that happens when you book a hotel, and that helps make sense of the overall meaning. So, we can't teach reading in isolation. It's a skill that stems from the other skills that we've talked about so far: vocabulary, chunk learning, even phonological work and grammar. And also, when it comes to more advanced levels of reading, a bit of general knowledge about life helps a good deal. So, if I were to show you that gapped text, you could use some inference skills, some sort of educated guessing, you might say, to work out the missing words. Just try it and see whether you could have guessed those. So reading can involve strategies as well. Knowing things about the language which enable you to guess, as well as your top-down knowledge of the world, which helps. Now, to go back to this question of word recognition, it appears that good first language readers recognize words really, really quickly. Eye tracking studies show that they move their eyes ahead 8 letter spaces per focus, so you're always sort of glancing forwards as you read. Apparently we focus 80% on content words and 35% of function words. So the little words like that and which don't carry much meaning and aren't very noticeable or salient when you read, we look at those less than we do the content words. We also know that readers often, if not always, say words aloud in their head. So if you think about yourself reading a text, how much are you actually saying those words out loud as you read? Certainly if you read as a beginner, you're doing that a lot. If you're reading at speed as a more experienced reader, then perhaps a little bit less. But you might like to try that experiment and say, am I actually sub-vocalizing here? Am I saying these words aloud in my head? Because if you are, it shows that there's a link not just with the written word, but with the phonological loop of working memory. In other words, you're saying words out loud. It's as if you hear them. So this is where listening and reading have quite an intimate relationship. So just to recap so far, we know that knowing words and chunks is vital, and we know that knowing syntax and morphology also helps. Syntax, of course, is to do with word order, and morphology is to do with the forms of words, for example, inflections on words. And together those two things make up grammar. So how do we read? So on the right here we have William Grabe, who is a scholar who is particularly associated with the study of reading. And this is his sum up about how we read. So moving on. We know that, particularly with younger learners and less skilled readers, that these poorer readers have problems processing sounds, and that could be the case for some of your students. We know that to have a clear phonological representation of a sound is important, and of a word is important as well. We remember words partly based on what they sound like. So if you recall from previous presentations, we said that knowing a word is quite a complex thing, and it's knowing the sound of a word that's an important aspect. So if we do listening and we do reading aloud, then we're going to produce better readers, including silent readers. You get better at what you practice. So just as we said for listening, and listening a lot helps, so does reading. And with lots of listening and reading, you're providing plenty of comprehensible input for the students, which we know is vital for language acquisition. Lynn Erler studied in England quite a lot of beginners, these are 11-year-olds at year 7, who were studying French. And after 1 year's teaching with 2 hours a week, their knowledge of spelling sound rules was poor. Effectively, they couldn't read aloud very well at all when you showed them words. And that was the conclusion that she drew. This would confirm, along with other research, that if we don't teach students to read aloud well and to decode, then they will also have problems with reading comprehension. She also found that 75% of that total sample thought it was useful to know pronunciation, and most of them also said that they were aware of subvocalizing to sounds when reading in French. So in other words, when we read quietly, we are activating the phonological loop, as I mentioned just a moment ago. There's some other points about reading as well which I'd like to throw in. Paul Nation, who has written a lot about vocabulary in particular and also about reading, points out that if we want students to be able to understand and process and encode in memory written texts, these texts need to be highly comprehensible. Now, he suggests that for most students, we're talking about 95 to 98% of words from a text already being known. And he said elsewhere that if you go below 80%, then effectively you don't make sense of the text at all. And so for our minds to be able to process language and lead to acquisition, texts need to be understood. So with our most able learners, perhaps you could go below that 95%. But for most of the students we teach, any text we provide them with, if we want it to be useful for acquisition, needs to be highly comprehensible. I'd like to make that point really strongly, and when you're looking at texts in your textbooks and when you're designing your own texts, have a look at how many words you think need glossing for the average child in that class. It's something I do myself, kind of instinctively really, when I'm selecting texts for FrenchTeacher.net and when I'm reworking texts and writing my own texts. I'm thinking, how many new words would there be in there for the target readership of that text? And if there are too many, then I would adapt the text further to make the language easier, or I might just reject the text out of hand. Now, this has important implications for text choice. Many people make the case for trying to use authentic texts as much as possible, My feeling about that is that really what's most important about a text is that it's comprehensible. Secondly, that it's relevant and interesting. So perhaps interesting for the students in itself, relevant because it relates to the syllabus that they're studying, because that's a really important factor. If it happens to be authentic as well, well then great. But, I would say that there are authentic texts which are dull and ones which are interesting. And there are teacher-written texts which may be boring, but could also be very interesting. For example, you could write texts that relate to the experience of your own class, or teachers within the school, or the local environment, and they might inherently be more interesting than an authentic text. On the other hand, authentic texts are often good for revealing the culture or cultures of the target language country, so they need to be taken on board for that reason. But of course, then typically what you would do is adapt the authentic text, so you're still including the cultural content, but making it relevant to the class. In case you're not sure of the definition of authentic text, well, there's argument about this, but on the whole, it's thought to be texts that are written by native speakers for native speakers, but there are some interesting arguments to be had around the idea of what actually is authentic. Some writers, notably Stephen Krashen, talk about the priority for reading texts to be interesting. Krashen has even talked about text being compelling, the idea being that really, if a text is so interesting, so absorbing, that a student gets into the flow of the reading, then they get totally focused on the meaning, and that's going to lead to greater acquisition. Of course, this is easier said than done, particularly with younger learners who only have a certain level of language to work with. It takes some skill to find texts which are really compelling, and I think most of us as teachers have to come to a compromise and find texts which are relevant to the syllabus and which include lots of high-frequency language. They may be more compelling arguments in your choice of text than finding texts which are intrinsically very, very interesting. But much is about context here, and I'm often in my talks here really referring to modern language lessons for relative beginners in an Anglophone context. And there the priorities might be different from, for example, teachers teaching English as a foreign language or as a second language in a context where there is lots of English beyond the classroom. A case can be made, certainly, once you get beyond beginner level, I would suggest, for what's called sustained silent reading. So if you were to have access to graded readers and could allocate a certain amount of time per week just for sustained silent reading of comprehensible texts, that would be a great thing to be able to do. But time is a luxury, and most teachers find they don't have time to include this. In a similar vein, what's called free voluntary reading is clearly very valuable. For many teachers, that might become possible more once you get beyond intermediate and into advanced level work, when you might make suggestions for where students can read online, for example. Let me give you one little idea that worked well for us in the school I taught at with advanced level readers. We would give them a task, so every week they had to go and find a text that interested them, and then come back with a brief summary in English and a glossary of new words that they'd found. And then to check that students were doing that, we would just simply have a look at what they'd done, not correct anything, but just monitor that they were doing this. You might suggest that that wasn't entirely voluntary reading, and you would be correct, but at least it did give them opportunity to read about what they wanted to. So, has what I've said above, does this exclude harder texts? Well, not necessarily, and sometimes we have to set harder texts. In England, for example, if you're teaching A-level, and in Wales and Northern Ireland, then you're given a set of texts, 20th century novels usually, which probably don't always fit the 95 to 9% comprehensibility, but they're part of the syllabus, so you have to do them and you have to work through them. And very motivated students with help can do this. And so teachers will scaffold the text in whatever way they need to, with word lists in particular, and with lots of classroom help, and that's fine. And in addition, some teachers would argue for not providing always these very highly comprehensible texts, but adapting the task to the text. So when you get a harder text that's less accessible, you lessen the difficulty level of the exercise that you put with it. The only danger of that is that you can end up then using text in a very superficial way. So, for example, just picking out some easy language that's in the text, which doesn't permit students to process the rest of the text in detail. And there's a case to be made here for making sure that whenever we use texts, we try and do so in an intensive way that allows the language to be processed. So I've covered a range of points there just as an introduction to reading. You could check out Informed Language Teacher for more readings and videos about the role of input in general, including reading. And there's an article there which is open access by William Grabe, where he talks about the key issues of reading. And Gianfranco Conti wrote an interesting blog there, which I've linked, where you might like to have a look at what he says about reading and some of the implications for language teachers. In the next session, which will be a much more practical one, I'm going to look at teaching with written texts, to give you more idea of what I mean by this intensive input-output work that you can do with written texts. In the meantime, check out the 3 books I've been involved in, and if you want to subscribe to this YouTube channel, that will give you alerts for any new videos that appear. And once again, thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you again. Bye.